Poverty in America. It's a concept that shouldn't be a thing, right? I mean, we are the richest nation in the world. Well, look around today and you're going to see a lot of us are struggling. For many, it's our own fault. Lots of us are broke because of decisions we made. But plenty of Americans live in poverty because of things outside their control. Perhaps it was a loss of jobs, or in many cases, it's the cost of living. Yes, poverty is a complicated issue here in the U.S., and no matter who's in office, it's a problem without an end in sight. The way we're going to measure poverty in this video is simple. We're going to look at which states have the highest percentage of its residents below the poverty line. And I'm confident you're going to be shocked by some of what we're going to talk about. Now, it's tough out there in America for millions of us. For a lot of us, there's no real optimism. If you live in poverty or near it, you're certainly not alone. Now, today we're going to talk about the poorest places in America and why they're poor. And since we're going to be talking about poor people, we should probably live like poor people. So we're going to hitchhike our way across the country. So let's get ready to go to the poorest pockets of America. Okay, so that wasn't so bad, was it? It only took us 17 hours to hitchhike all the way to Alabama, but we made it for free. So you've heard it all before when it comes to the amount of poverty here in Alabama. This isn't a surprise. To determine our rankings, we looked at each state's poverty rate for the last 3 years. Here in Alabama, that number is 12%. So at some point, 12% of the population here has lived below the poverty line in the last 3 years. For comparison, the U.S. average is about 10.5%. And there's a lot of states that are just behind Alabama's 12%. The poverty rankings we're going to use take into account the traditional measure of poverty, how many people earn less than the amount needed to live a decent life. But the census also factors in the cost of living too. So a population can earn a decent salary, but if the cost of living's high, they're going to struggle. Here in Alabama, a lot of the poverty isn't because of a high cost of living problem, though. When you look at the average cost to own or rent a home, Alabama's the fourth cheapest of all states. If it wasn't so cheap to live here, Alabama would be much poorer than it is. No, Alabama has so much poverty because so many people are uneducated and because there's not a lot of good jobs in the rural areas. The United Nations once did a study and it said parts of Alabama have the worst poverty in the developed world. One UN official said he was shocked at the level of environmental degradation in parts of rural Alabama, saying he had never seen anything like it before in the developed world. I think it's very uncommon in the first world, he said. There's not a sight that one normally sees. He cited one part of the state where raw sewage flowed from homes through exposed pipes and into trenches and pits. Now we're going to see the same problems in some other states we're going to talk about, which we'll address throughout the video. And while this isn't a cost of living problem in Alabama, in some states we're going to visit later, cost of living is the main reason so many people live in poverty. But let's visit our next state. Okay, so we're here in South Carolina, our 9th poorest state. That's not a surprise, right? Back in the colonial days, South Carolina was a very wealthy region. But in the 1900s, people started leaving this state, and it's been hard to create jobs outside of agriculture here for years now. It's just bad across the board here. South Carolina ranks 4th worst for credit scores, and it has the nation's 4th highest credit card debt. There's just too many people here trying to get by on low wages and with a poor education. Now, some South Carolina leaders feel it begins with the kids. South Carolina ranks 3rd from the bottom when it comes to the number of parks for kids to play in. It has the 10th worst ranked schools and the 5th lowest number of daycare facilities per capita. While this state's growing quickly, there's still a long way to go to change the rural poverty here. But it's not just the rural areas that are broke. Myrtle Beach has a lot of poverty, and there's a lot of people there. And even on the northern side of Charleston, a very wealthy city, there's lots of people living in poverty. One South Carolina activist says it's going to take the residents themselves to enact change. It's up to us as individuals to select an issue dear to our hearts, whether it's housing, healthcare, nutrition, or addiction. We have to become an advocate for pragmatic solutions that really work. And hopefully, people in South Carolina do just that. Now, as a country, the U.S. has a lot of safety nets to prevent people from living in poverty. Social Security payments help older folks. We knew that. There's food stamps and cash payments that help younger families make ends meet. And stimulus payments like we saw during the pandemic, although a lot of people took advantage of that one. But another big factor are medical expenses. In fact, today, medical expenses are the biggest factor contributing to poverty. That's just sad and pathetic. Here we are, the richest country in the world, and many of us live in poverty because we're behind on medical bills. We're going to talk more about the cost of medical care as we get further into this video. Now we can just walk to our next poorest state. No need for a ride there, because we're right next door in Georgia, which is tied with South Carolina. Here, 12.1% of residents live in poverty relative to the cost of living. In Georgia, it's not really a cost of living thing either. The cost of living here is the 6th lowest in the nation, though home prices are going up fast, especially in the Atlanta metro area. It's just in many parts of the state outside of the Atlanta area, there just aren't any good jobs. But there's good news for Georgia. The poverty rates have been going down. The job growth here has been increasing at a rate faster than the nation as a whole, and the state's tried to incentivize large companies to move to the state. A lot of the job growth has been in construction, transportation, and manufacturing, the types of jobs that don't pay great, but they're enough to lift people out of poverty. Kinda. Another encouraging sign is a lot more younger people with college degrees are moving to Georgia. And one researcher says Georgia's poverty rates have gone down because low-income, undocumented Hispanics have left the state. That's interesting. Now, I know you're looking at this list and you might be thinking, so far this list has been traditionally conservative states. And when you talk about poverty, politics is the first thing people from the left and right bring up. I see all the comments you guys write. The liberals say, most of the poor places are red states. Their policies aren't working. And the conservatives say, look at all these poor people in Democrat cities. It's welfare and communism that keeps these people so poor, so they'll keep voting blue. But is that true? Well, we're going to answer that question at the end of the video. But for now, we're going to hitch a ride to our next poorest state. Now we're here in New Mexico, our 7th poorest state. New Mexico's been a poor state forever now. And if it wasn't for the super low cost of living, it would rank much higher on this list. The state ranks first in the country for childhood poverty. Look at this chart. 36% of kids under the age of 5 live in poverty in the whole state. That's the highest rate in the nation by far. And it's going up too. Now, demographics have been a major driving force behind New Mexico's long-term poverty. The state is 47% Hispanic, and that's the highest rate in the nation. New Mexico is also 10% Native American, and that's the second highest rate, right behind Alaska. And Hispanics and Native American populations have traditionally high poverty rates and lower educational attainment. There's nothing new with that. That's how it's always been. But there's a bunch of issues New Mexico needs to address. They need educated people. They need more funding to get these people an education. And they need good jobs for people who do have an education. I mean, 1 in 5 kids here lives in a home where at least one parent is without a high school degree. 1 in 5. Plus, New Mexico cut childcare funding by 27%, so working families struggle to get ahead. And get this, childcare is more expensive than in-state college tuition is here. What the hell? And in New Mexico, the poor pay 11% of their income on taxes, and the rich pay 5% of their income on taxes. There's just a bunch of backwards stuff going on in New Mexico. Come on, New Mexico, you can fix this. We're going right next door to our next poorest place, and it's not Arizona. This might be a huge surprise, but it's Texas. Yes, one of our most populous states and the place more people are moving to than anywhere else. In Texas, 12.5% of people live in relative poverty. And it's not the cost of living here. Texas is about average when it comes to the cost of living. So what's going on in Texas? Well, clearly there's a big discrepancy between the rich and poor here. A lot of the border towns are going to be super poor, with a lot of uneducated Hispanics. And then you have these super wealthy suburbs of Dallas, Houston, and Austin, which are certainly not poor. This map shows that trend. In these Texas border towns, 1 in 3 families live in poverty. But in the wealthy suburbs, about 8% of people are poor. And apparently Black and Hispanic kids in Texas are 3 times as likely to live in poverty when compared to white and Asian kids. And single moms have it tough here too. women in Texas earn about 80% of what men are paid here. Another factor has been a surge in international residents flooding Texas. Now, we see all the people down at the border trying to get in. That's a separate problem. But this state's growing at a rate of more than 1,000 people a day, and more than half of these newcomers are migrants from other countries, not just South America. It's just kind of all over the place here. You have all these uneducated migrants flooding in, and then you have these college-educated young families moving here. Each one is pushing the poverty rate in different directions. And one other issue that plagues Texans is the uninsured population. 17% of Texans don't have health insurance, and that's the highest uninsured rate in the state. All those medical bills, people. Now here's another state that might throw you off. State of New York. Now, unlike many of the other states we talked about so far, the problem here isn't income levels or job opportunities. Sure, upstate has its challenges with the loss of manufacturing jobs. The median income statewide is the 14th highest of all states at $67,000 a year per household. But the problem in New York is the cost of living. It's not the income levels, it's not the jobs, it's higher taxes, it's super high home prices, it's expensive rent and medical care costs. The cost of living in New York is the second highest in the nation. It's 15% higher than the national average. And keep in mind, 40% of the state's population lives in the New York City metro area, and we know how expensive it is to live there. Like 2.5 times the national average. And because of that, less than a third of New York City residents own their homes. 1 in 5 kids in the state of New York lives in poverty, but in Rochester, Buffalo, and the Bronx, half of kids live in poverty. And another interesting study shows that New York City's Asian population has now surpassed its Hispanic population as its poorest minority group. Now, this state has plans to address childhood poverty, or at least they're talking about it. Just recently, the governor here says he's trying to push a bill through that would cut childhood poverty in half. If the bill's approved, it would establish a Child Poverty Reduction Council. Plans include expanding the state's earned income tax credits for poor families, expanding work training programs, expanding access to subsidized housing, expanding access to health care, and increasing welfare payments regardless of immigration status. We'll see how that goes. But for now, back down to the Deep South we go. This is Louisiana, and we managed to get here in 22 hours via various hitchhiking strategies. Some nice people, I'll tell you, especially all those truckers. You probably won't be surprised to hear Louisiana is one of the poorest states. It's been this way since agriculture died decades ago. You might find that a lot of people down here just don't really care that they're poor. They're a happier bunch than those in the Northeast, and a lot of people down here spend a lot of time in church or partying. And there's a sense of fatalism here. It is what it is. We're poor because that's what God wants. Louisiana has a culture that doesn't value education, and therefore it's hard to get companies to locate here because the population isn't very skilled or motivated. Except for the energy companies. Oh, they're all here and they're all motivated. However, despite all that money generated by the energy companies, hardly any of that trickles back into the poor communities. Some of the parishes down here should be the wealthiest counties in the country based on the income created by oil and gas, but they're all still very poor. The big companies in Louisiana get bigger, and the little people who live down here remain uneducated, on welfare, in jail, and unhealthy. Now, what about the demographics of poverty in America? Well, there's clearly a disparity between us when it comes to who lives in poverty and who doesn't. This chart shows that women are 1 percentage point more likely to live in poverty than men. The poorest Americans are children. 18% of single moms live in poverty compared to 5% of married couples. Just over 6% of white Americans live in poverty. More than 14% of black Americans live in poverty. For Asians, it's nearly 9%. And Hispanics are just about as likely to live in poverty as African Americans. We can see the value of an education. Hardly any college degree holders are in poverty, but 1 in 5 Americans without a high school diploma are. Oh, there's more. Today, about 8% of people born in the U.S. live in poverty, but it's double for non-Native Americans. We can see that people who rent are 4 times as likely to live in poverty than those who own their homes. And finally, people in the West and South are more likely to live in poverty than those in the Northeast or Midwest. And that's interesting because the West and South are the fastest growing regions in America today. But for now, we're going to move to our next poorest state, Florida. Florida? What? It's true. 14% of Floridians live in poverty. That's not a surprise when you factor in the high cost of living and the number of immigrants and the number of elderly in Florida. 21% of Florida residents are 65 or older. Many are wealthy retirees, but many are not. Look at this chart. 13% of all grandparents living in poverty in the whole nation live here in Florida. And a big problem is the average cost of medical care. The average cost of medical care is $12,000 a year for people over 65 today. That's triple what it is for people in their 30s. So grandma and grandpa down in Florida have close to $25,000 a year in medical expenses alone. And in Florida, 13% of residents don't have health insurance either. That's the fourth highest uninsured rate of all states. Now, the average Florida retiree only gets about $1,500 a month in Social Security, so a lot of their Social Security checks are gobbled up with healthcare costs. What do we do to figure that out? I mean, when people are going to Mexico or Canada for medical procedures, that's pretty embarrassing, right? That's like Daddy Warbucks sending Annie next door to borrow a lawnmower. What the hell? Now, this is another case where it's not the cost of living that's making people poor. Mississippi's the cheapest state to live in when you look at the average cost to buy a home or rent. Food prices are also far below most other states. But Mississippi has the same problem that other poor southern states have. They're just magnified here. It's a lack of education, a lack of good jobs, and a generational acceptance that being poor is just a way of life here. There aren't any big cities here to attract companies in Mississippi, and there's not a highly educated workforce to justify companies to locate here. Fact is, down here, religion rules the day. More people down here care about social issues than economic ones. Now, before we get to the final state, it's worth noting that Washington, D.C. actually has a higher rate of poverty than our final state. In D.C., 17% of folks live in poverty. It's likely that D.C.'s $680,000 average home value is a big reason for that. But D.C.'s not a state, so we move on. And which states are poorest of all? This may or may not be a shocker, but it's California, people. It's actually been reported by several major media outlets lately. Now, technically, when you measure the amount of people who live in poverty, California should be the 18th poorest state. But the cost of living here is so outrageous that more people in California live in poverty than any other place. California has the 6th highest income levels, but a third of Californians earn less than $15 an hour. There's a shrinking middle class here. People here are really rich or really poor. It's so bad that even Disneyland workers are suing for higher pay. What? More than a third of California residents are poor or near poor, according to the Public Policy Institute of California. It's estimated that without all of California's safety nets, 25% of California residents would live in direct poverty. And that is a shame for the world's 5th biggest economy. The cost of living in California is the 3rd highest in the nation. It's the cost of transportation, insurance, taxes, gas, food, and of course, housing costs. The average home in this state is now $800,000. I mean, can you imagine? People here just can't make that much money, so more and more people get pushed into poverty. California policies make it really hard to build affordable homes too. Of course, there's environmental regulations, and they have all these rules against cramming too many units into one lot, although supposedly they're going to change that law soon. But is it too late? I mean, how many affordable housing units can one state actually build? A lot of people say you can't, and the high cost of living is one reason so many people are fleeing this state for cheaper alternatives. Of course, California has all these safety nets in place to keep people out of poverty despite the high cost of living. Poor people pay less in taxes. California has CalFresh, its version of food stamps, and they give food to the poor. CalWorks is a program that gives cash payments to poor families with kids at home. But there's just so many welfare recipients here that the state's going broke trying to keep up. I mean, would you remain in California? You could struggle to keep your head above water with that good salary, or you could take that good salary and move to another state where you could live a comfortable life. That's exactly what thousands of Californians are doing every single week. Now, I know you're curious, which states are the least poor, or richest, I guess you could say? Well, the states with the lowest poverty rates are Minnesota, Kansas, Iowa, and Rhode Island. And finally, I promised a breakdown of the whole conservative versus liberal state debate. Now, if you look at which states are poor and compare that to traditional voting patterns, what are we going to see? Well, in yellow are the poorest states we just talked about. 6 of these 10 voted conservative in the last election, so a little more than half. And here in green are the 10 states with the least poverty. Of these 10, half voted conservative and half voted liberal. So it's pretty much a damn tie for both. Interesting. There's a lot of reasons many of us are poor. It's not just our income levels or a loss of jobs. It's rising costs for food, energy, transportation, and homes. It's higher taxes. It's higher childcare costs and medical expenses. Of course, people are going to say, we spend all these billions of dollars helping other countries. Maybe we should spend less money overseas and help our own citizens. Well, an alternative is, do we let people fend for themselves and just get out of their way and make it easier to create their own wealth? That's an option. Or do people just not care? Maybe they like living the way they do. What do you think? Okay, so we talked about the growing problem of poverty in America. You know, there's kids that live in such a bad environment that the food they get at school is the only food they get all day, right? There's probably a bunch of kids in your city right now who have to deal with that. It's terrible. Just keep that in mind the next time you think you're having a bad day. What can you, the average American, do to help? Well, average American, you could volunteer at a nonprofit that gives out food, or you could start a food drive, or you could encourage your company to donate to the fight against hunger. You just might find your company's not doing anything to help, and they might benefit by donating to nonprofits. Ask your boss what your company can do. You might be surprised. Hey guys, so if anything I just talked about upset you or made you sad or mad, well then do something about it. Call your local leaders and demand change. Chip in and help those in need. Make your community better, because communities don't get better without hard work and determination. America's a great place. It just needs some more love and pride.
This is Sage, Nick's manager. This has been a Corner House Entertainment production.
And are you looking to move and need advice? I do consulting. That's right. I'll sit down and talk about where the next perfect place for you and your family should be. I do it all the time. Together, let's find you a new home that's safe and checks all your boxes. You can get my email in the description to find out how I can help you find your perfect relocation.